Okay. All right, then shall I just start today's webinar? And we are going to discuss geopolitics and democracy. For the last 2 decades, I think there are 3 kinds of trends. One is very global democratic backsliding. Freedom House and other the democracy index reports point out around 2005 and 2006, many countries, the democratic preference ranking have been declined. And second trend is very weakened liberal international order. So therefore, there is an alternative model. If I say specifically, the Chinese model is becoming popular to developing countries. And also China is forming kind of alternative international organization and even international court. And at the same time, there are third trend we can witness. That's the decline of US power. We recall since 9/11, 2001 and 2008, there is the US-led financial crisis. Now from last year, the pandemic. So this is the kind of interrelated. So domestic democratic backsliding and weakened international liberal international order and the weakening US supremacy in international order. I think that must be explained properly. I think the Western leaders know about this dilemma. So that's why in the Cadiz Bay G7 summit communique, the leaders of the Western world and other Asian and Pacific leaders, they called to embrace the democratic values for the sake of open and resilient international order. And I think they do know about this Western democracy need a partnership, especially from Asia, and not to mention of Europe. So I think we have to ask how the democracy can be restored means we can strengthen the liberal and rules-based order. So for this webinar, I specifically asked speakers 3 questions: how they assess this insertion of democratic values to functional corporations like a technical, the clean technology coalition, and that kind of, and even trade linkages. And also, I like to ask how speakers see the future of international order, whether they see the liberal order can prevail, or they see there must be 2 spheres of influence, one led by more democratic regimes, and the other by autocratic and authoritarian regimes. Whether this kind of division of the 2 spheres of influence is feasible or not, because we are so much, interrelated functionally. And lastly, I'd like to ask what Asian countries, particularly Asian democracies, can help to restore or strengthen the rules-based, the liberal order, and also assisting more democratic resilience or democratic governance of developing countries. So therefore, I think these topics are actually huge, but our eminent speakers can answer these big questions. You don't need an introduction because we've known each other through this network and through other interactions. Our first speaker will be Mike Green, the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at the Foreign Service of Georgetown University. And our speaker, Jay Panda, as a National Vice President of BJP and a full-time member of Parliament of India. And our third speaker, Young Kwan-yoon, is a former Foreign Minister of South Korea and also Seoul National University Emeritus Professor. So I'd like to ask three speakers to speak about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up live discussions. So when you like to ask questions or when you like to offer some comments, why don't you raise your hand? You can see at the bottom. Then I will just call your name. So without further ado, Mike, you are the first one to speak.
Great, thank you. And it's really nice to see friends, even if you're only 1 inch tall on my screen. Let me answer Suk-jong's questions, 3 questions quickly. Can we cooperate more on functional issues? Absolutely. I think one of the challenges and opportunities will lie in our ability to think about how to mainstream democratic norms in our trade policy, our infrastructure financing, our development policy. And the countries represented by the speakers today have a casting vote in how we do that. Japan's the largest infrastructure financer in the world, larger than China. Korea's aid through KOICA is active all across the region. India's Look East policy increasingly has India at the table shaping these debates in the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, and of course, South Asia. And the key is how do we move from a strategic concept to implementation? And I think it's very doable. Second question, is the liberal order doomed? No, absolutely not. The surveys we've done at CSIS over the years and other surveys by other organizations show that despite the backsliding in democracy chronicled by Freedom House, the aspiration for democratic norms is growing stronger around the world. And in our surveys of thought leaders across Asia, democratic norms from women's empowerment to good governance to human rights are considered essential to regional integration and success. That was not true 20 years ago. So while I always tease Mike Abramowitz, yes, there is backsliding, that's a problem, but the aspirations and expectations of people are going in the other direction. And the most powerful and important countries in Asia are democracies. China is going to have success exploiting bad governance and corruption, but it's not going to be in the leading states. And that's our call, is what can we as the leading democracies do to help governance, democracy, women's empowerment in those parts of the world, especially Asia, where China's geopolitical goals lead them increasingly to support authoritarian regimes, provide technology for surveillance, undermine civil society. But the liberal order has enormous promise because the liberal order is no longer transatlantic. It's global and especially Asian. And that gets to the third question, which is, can Asian countries play a role? And my answer, and the whole premise of Sunnylands, is yes. And indeed, that's essential precisely because China is making the argument in its public discourse, in its propaganda in global times, that democracy is a transatlantic, Euro-American, Canadian theme. Japan is in it because, of course, Japan's not Asian, whereas the global South is unified behind China's opposition to interference in internal affairs and so on and so forth. So this can only succeed, this effort to both shore up the international order and have more effective delivery of support for governance and democracy. It can only succeed if the Indo-Pacific or Asian component is more prominent. So let me spend the last 5 minutes talking about the US, because democracy as a theme is at the top of the Biden administration's agenda, as you know. There will be a democracy summit virtually. Then there will be what the administration calls a year of action. where they want to see countries make pledges. And then there will be an in-person summit towards the end of 2023. President Biden is absolutely committed to doing this. No one will talk him out of it. He is an institutionalist. He's a man of the Senate and the Congress. He believes in democratic institutions. And he was shocked by the right-wing racist rally in Charlottesville. And that's what motivated him to run for president, to save our democracy from right-wing tendencies. So he will do this. There's a challenge, though. There's a problem, and we're off the record. I wouldn't say this publicly. The problem is that the planning for this summit, the conceptualization of the summit, remains in the administration very Eurocentric. Until recently, officials have told us that over 90% of the planning and coordination has been with Europe. 90%. Lynn and I brokered a discussion between the key officials working on the summit in the White House and the chargés, the DCMs of Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, to inject in their planning some views from Asia and also from our Sunnylands principles. And I think it had some positive impact. And I think there is more coordination, but still this remains a largely Eurocentric exercise. And the administration is struggling with, and is divided, frankly, is divided about how to approach it. One group thinks we need a group of countries that commit to either more funding or more objectives for their own democracy. And if that's a fairly small group that comes to the meeting, that's okay. Because at least the mandate and the mission will be very clear and up to our standards or norms. The other group, which, as you would expect, tends to include the Asia experts and State Department, has the view that we can't do that, because if we do, we'll end up excluding countries like the Philippines or Thailand, which are US allies. We'll end up unable to include Vietnam, which is not a democracy, but in some indicators like women's empowerment or even governance is improving. Will make it extremely difficult for India or Indonesia. And Indonesia, DCM was also invited to our meeting, make it extremely difficult for countries like India or Indonesia to enthusiastically participate, because it forces them to sort of adopt a Western frame. And so that's the debate right now. And I'll tell you candidly what my preference is. I think Lynn agrees. I would like to see a summit, and maybe the initial summit is fairly small, 10 or 15 leaders who President Biden can say are our most trusted confidants and advisors. I would think Japan and Korea would be in that, India, I would hope. But then I would like to see, and I'm urging my friends in the White House and State Department to encourage satellite meetings. So India could host a meeting, Japan could host a summit or meeting on governance, democracy, and infrastructure. Korea could do one perhaps on development. Indonesia could do one on Islam and democracy. I think this would be better done as a constellation of dialogues that holds a high standard for what constitutes good governance and democracy, but is open and inclusive. That's a very tricky diplomatic architecture. And I think that the meeting we had allowed Korea and India and others to start making this argument more directly to the White House. But I am sympathetic with those who worry that if we open it up too much, it will completely dilute the meeting. So the Bali Democracies Forum, which Marty started, is frankly what they're afraid of, that we'll end up with a democracy dialogue that includes countries like Iran or Syria. Bottom line is, the administration has emphasized allies and partners. They've emphasized the Indo-Pacific, and they've emphasized democracy. And if our partners in the region are speaking up and shaping the debate, I think that will shape, how President Biden thinks about this. And frankly, a lot of our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific have been somewhat passive in this dialogue, whereas the Europeans have been very aggressive trying to shape it. So through the Sunnylands process from outside government, I think we can play a role in really encouraging a more dynamic input from the Indo-Pacific into the process. And it'll be a more successful outcome if we do. So I'll stop there, Seok-Jong. And off the record, of course, our meeting that Lynn and I organized was off the record, but I think it's important for you to understand the dynamics and how important the Sunnylands dialogue is in that process in Washington.
Mike, maybe this is the off the record comment from myself if I ask Jay Panda to speak. And the Democracy Summit is set for December 9 and 10, but you haven't finalized which country President Biden is going to invite. And 3 agendas are set: defending against authoritarianism, and also the fighting corruption, and also advancing respect for human rights. And you have mentioned that the whole process has been very Eurocentric. And I heard Lynn was trying to breach the White House with the South Korean government. But I also checked our leaders in the foreign ministry. They don't know. And they are saying why the Blinken and other people are not talking about this summit if it's planned to be held this year. So it's very funny, there must be a lack of coordination inside the White House. So maybe they should outreach to Asian partners, allies more vigorously, and rather than complaining why Asian allies are so passive, to setting up this agenda. So this is a off the record comment from myself. All right,
so
and then
actually, if I could just add,
yeah,
our last conversation, and since the meeting that Mike and I organized, there has been some progress on the South Korea front. There's a direct communication. I think South Korea is now a little more excited than the last time we took. So I just want you to know that the communication is finally happening.
It's great to hear that. Okay. All right, and I would like to invite Mr. Jay Panda. So, Mr. Panda, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I think the introduction by moderator Seok-Jong Lee was excellent in framing what the developments have been over the past 2 decades and more. And I couldn't agree more. I've participated in many such discussions with Mike Green and others, where we've discussed over the first 2 decades of this century about the so-called Beijing consensus and whether it was overcoming the Washington consensus, and there had been back and forth that the challenges to US power being relative rather than absolute. But I think in the last 2 years, we have seen a very substantive shift. And so rather than repeating the backdrop of the past 20 years, if we just look at the last approximately 2 years, coterminous with the pandemic, then we see 3 rather major setbacks to democracy. We've seen what's happened and happening in Hong Kong. We've seen the regression in Myanmar, and of course now in Afghanistan. All 3 are Asian countries and have are crucial to this discussion that we are having. We should also, if we look at the impact for democracy, it looks a little bleak because of these developments. But I think we should take a larger view and also see the strengths that democratic movements have. So, for example, there's a report from Brookings which points out that despite all the gloom and doom, if you take a rational view, Asia remains, and I quote, Asia remains considerably freer and more democratic now in 2020 than it was throughout the Cold War. So just to keep perspective. Yes, democracy is never a smooth process. There will always be, two steps forward, one step back. It's a tumultuous process, but we should keep that perspective in mind. Now, the challenges to democracy, particularly the Beijing consensus, if you will, are very real. And one of the issues raised for this discussion was the conditionalities in the kind of foreign aid that the BRI, for instance, is setting, and how this is very different from how foreign aid had worked in the previous 60 or 70 years. Now, this is a very real situation, because in the past we've talked generally on principles, but if you, now there's a new report out by the Center for Global Development, which says that at least 8 BRI recipients, and let me name them: Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, the Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, are at a high risk of debt distress, specifically due to BRI. Now, these are clear-cut challenges to the democratic movements, because this is a new form of imperialism. We've seen what has happened to the port in Sri Lanka, and these are challenges that we can't take lightly. One of the challenges to democracy from an Indian perspective, and increasingly, I would imagine, from other countries, is that the threat of terrorism isn't going away. We've seen what's, with all that effort and expense and commitment in Afghanistan over 20 years, we're really back to square one of where we started. And India, having invested nearly $3 billion in the Afghanistan reconstruction project, is something that comes home when you see this kind of a collapse there. I want to touch on something that Mike mentioned about how an earlier understanding of liberal democracies was understood to be a transatlantic construct, and how it has moved forward. So I want to add that democracy in that era, in the Cold War and thereafter, didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed because of alliances. It existed because of arrangements like NATO, without which democracy in that era would have faced huge challenges. So as we move forward to the 21st century arena for democracies around the world, we need new constructs, new alliances, new arrangements to provide the support systems for the growth of democracy. And I would like to highlight one, which is the Quad, which is India, US, Australia, and Japan. Now, the Quad has been an idea that has been around for a very long time, but has only really in recent years started taking off. And its core concept is for the 4 significant democracies in Asia, which have a great stake in this region, and working together, not just for naval exercises and things like that, but on broader principles of working to ensure that all countries play by the rules which provide for open communications, open sea lanes, and so on and so forth. Because what had been expected of China didn't quite play out. The whole thinking that as China became prosperous, it would become a democracy like many other Asian countries have, didn't quite happen. And so these are challenges that we need to face up. The Quad is getting a lot of energy. This month, it has just been finalized. There will be a first physical summit, I think in Washington, DC, perhaps later this month. So I think institutions like the Quad are necessary to provide the support systems. Now, where are the areas that we can cooperate, and where are the areas where we can provide that, that environment, that ambiance for democracies? I see at least one more. One of the greatest challenges that every nation faces is the climate. And in the past, we had been riven by fundamental disagreements. Countries like India, for instance, had an attitude that, look, we didn't create most of the carbon footprint problem, but today we are contributing more. But on a per capita basis, if you value every human life equally, then we are still very low. And this contrasted the expectations from other countries, that countries like India must do more. And I think the turning point here is that in the last 5 or 7 years under Prime Minister Modi, we've taken a very dramatic decision, and the resources put in for clean energy in India has been quite stunning in the past 5 or 7 years. In fact, the US climate czar, John Kerry, just yesterday, I believe, specifically referred to this, saying that India has become a global leader in demonstrating that high economic growth rates and clean energy can go hand in hand. So to sum up, I would like to say that these challenges are very real. The challenges are no longer just in the theoretical realm or just in the track 2 realm that we've seen in past decades. These are very, very real challenges that we are facing today. And we do need to get democracies to work closer together. I've mentioned 2 specific areas, one which already exists, the Quad. I think we need to have maybe other similar constructs like the Quad, and certainly on areas like the climate and in economic arrangements where there is equity between these nations, we can do more. I think already some issues have been flagged as to who at this stage can participate. There are certain countries that nominally look like democracies because they have elections. But I think there must be a minimum bar as to whether those elections are free for anybody to participate. And if they are not, then I think that could be an issue with certain nations, Iran, for instance, which Mike pointed out. And whether you can have nations that aren't democracies, but meet some of those standards, I think is a good question. And my concluding thought would be that rather than try to scale up the number of participants very quickly, it would be better to take a longer term view and to grow the group slowly and gradually and getting buy-in at every step. So for instance, I think the Quad, perhaps, in my opinion, deserves to have 1 or 2 other members, but certainly not 5 more members, certainly not for it to become a mirror image of many of these large multilateral arrangements, which today seem to be out of sync with the needs of where the world is. So I will conclude with that. And of course, we'll take these issues up further in Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Panda. Actually, the Quad, the in-person summit was set for September 24th. That's how I read. I think Mr. Panda brought the issue of Afghanistan. I'd like to bring this issue during our discussion time. Okay, let me invite our third speaker, Minister Yoon Young-Kwan.
Thank you very much, Suk-Jong. And again, it's my great pleasure to participate in this conference. The main theme of this conference, I guess, is geopolitics and democracy, which is a fascinating topic and very, serious topic. The relationship between geopolitics and democracy is a kind of controversial and very complicated issue. But in my personal view, I think for democracy to prosper, to be able to prosper in the global society, it needs some kind of favorable geopolitical condition. In other words, if I use the term such as power and value, for a certain value to be predominant in a global community, I think it needs some kind of favorable power distribution or a geopolitical condition. For example, the rise of fascism in the 1930s was very much caused by the leadership vacuum. At that time, Great Britain was retreating from the international leadership position, and the US was reluctant to exercise its leadership with some democratic values. And fascist and some populist ideas filled the vacuum. And what happened after that, we all know. And the rise of democracy since around mid-1970s. And I think the rise of democracy in the last quarter of the 20th century was very much influenced by the US policy redirection toward the emphasis on the issue of human rights. For example, President Carter emphasized the importance of value of human rights as his guidance in terms of foreign policy making. And of course, the United States was a kind of a superpower around that time. And also the rise of democracy in the last quarter of the 20th century was very much influenced by the collapse of the communism and the Soviet Union. Regarding the current rise of autocracy and seemingly retreating democracy these days may have been influenced much by, for example, the rise of relative power of China. If, for example, China could converge to a kind of Western democracy as most political leaders of the United States had expected, I think the rising China would not necessarily become a threat against the United States and against the free world. But actually, China, especially after the beginning of Xi Jinping rule, turned toward the other opposite direction, and it has become much more autocratic and anti-democratic. So I think the rise of China, I think had affected the current difficulties in that way. And probably there may be two other reasons for the seemingly rising influence of autocracy these days. First, it will be growing economic inequality in democratic states. I think many democratic governments in the West could not deal with the side effects of neoliberal economic orthodoxy and globalization. For example, there were many disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged people as the result of globalization. But many democratic governments could not embrace those disadvantaged people through effective social policies like providing social safety net or job retraining, etc., etc. And their anger in the later period was utilized by populist leaders, and that I think caused kind of current problem of instability of many democracies in the world. I think digitalization and automation was another factor which contributed to the weakening of democracy, because especially digitalization sped up the flow of information, and worsened the partisan polarization and made populism more influential in public opinion making process. So these three things were important causes, in my view, of recently weakening democracy nowadays. And how to respond to this problem then? I think certainly it is very important to build international cooperation. By building and strengthening international coalition of democratic states, I think we can weaken the capability of autocratic states to infiltrate and distort democratic systems in democratic states. So I think we need to continue our efforts to build and strengthen international coalition of democratic states. I think in that regard, Quad is an important tool, and it is a right policy to confront the current difficulties. Another thing I'd like to mention is that the United States is the most important shaping power of international order. So I think whether the US political leaders will be able to overcome all political difficulties and obstacles and be successful in rebuilding a kind of model democratic system in the United States will matter much. In one way or another, what is going on and actually what will happen, for example, in the next midterm election next year and presidential election in 2024 will influence the tone and general direction of global diplomacy much. And then what kind of concrete, suggestions can I make in terms of strengthening global democracy and confronting rising influence of autocracy effectively? First, I'd like to suggest, the Western democratic states to try to build democratic norms against misuse of digital technology. For example, China has been exporting surveillance technology as well as digital authoritarianism. And Western countries actually haven't done anything to confront this kind of trend effectively. So trying to build an international norm against the misuse of digital technology will be an important political initiative. Let me remind you of the example of non-proliferation treaty. A non-proliferation treaty went in effect in 1970. And the first successful test of nuclear weapons was in 1945. It took about 25 years. But I think it was very right thing for the US policymakers to try to build, that kind of regime, NPT regime, with, cooperation of other nuclear states. If actually, the West did not try to build that kind of norm, I think the world might have been much more dangerous and worse by now. So, of course, this is very ambitious and a huge task, and it may take a long time, but I think it is worthwhile for us to try to go toward that direction. The second suggestion is, try to find the method of responding or reacting Chinese use of economic interdependence for political purpose. For example, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and Sweden, there are many more and more countries being punished by Chinese economic sanction. And Western countries haven't done anything about this. They just, stayed silent. And I think it is not good. And I think now is time for the West to try to build a kind of, project or common reaction program or something like that. For example, what about building a kind of emergency fund among democratic states, so that a country which would be punished by China be able to use that fund to mitigate the difficulties, economic difficulties in one way or another. I think that will have significant symbolic impact in global community. Finally, I'd like to suggest the Western, democratic states, to try harder to make so-called a Build Back Better World project more concrete. I think that project came too late. It is behind, 8 years behind the One Belt, One Road project of China. So I think even though it is late, I think we, the older democratic states need to strengthen their effort at this project more concrete, and make this project ready to be translated into complete projects as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you for suggesting 3 concrete ideas. In particular, I like this Build Back Better World. Maybe we should organize democratic donors to support this Build Back Better World idea. Okay, I think 3 great speakers talked about how Asian countries, especially Asian democracies, are important to work together with America. And at the same time, some Asians worry about sustainability of this kind of leadership if there is a political change in the USA first. Let's say if Trump got reelected, what would happen? And second, and they say, well, even President Biden may compromise these democracy ideas for the other purpose because they have deal with so many global agendas and national interests. Okay, so it's a time for discussion, and I'm sure members of our network are very eloquent in addressing important questions and comments. So who will be the first?
Can I say something? This is Marty.
Sure, Marty.
Yes.
Why not?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this roundtable, and I have listened carefully and taken careful notes of all the various views that have been shared. personally, I'm yet to fully clarify my thoughts on this nexus between geopolitics and democracy. I think it is one of the an area that needs a great deal of thorough analysis and thinking through. There is clearly a correlation. There is clearly a relevance between the two domains, but the perspectives or the ramifications are often seen from different sides. In terms of for me, in terms of a country like Indonesia, for instance, one of our main preoccupation or our main belief is that democratic resilience or sustainability is first and foremost an internally generated process, and otherwise there will be a risk of such a process not being sustained. And therefore, we want to be sure how well-intended expression of support from outside really matches and synergize with the internal dynamics. Otherwise, there is a risk of disconnect and like a short-termism in terms of its impact. So, we see in many countries that have begun internally triggered in democratic process, the process have not become sustained after a certain period of time, notwithstanding the various kind of support that had been lent to build democratic capacities and institutions. It proved to be unsustainable, and there was not enough resiliency. So I think how to get the right mixture, the right balance, not too much in terms of suffocating the sense of local ownership and local investment of efforts, but at the same time not complete neglect. I think this is a very difficult balance to strike, but I appreciate very much, at least now from Washington, there is a recognition that this is an issue that needs placed at the forefront of global agenda. And I heard carefully, I took note of what Mike's point just now of the planned democracy summit and the idea of having the process being inclusive. I think it's extremely important. We have the General Assembly coming up in the weeks to come, in the coming weeks. I hope that President Biden will speak on the issue as well, because it's such an important platform. But I'm afraid I have to be excused. I have another meeting coming up, but I will obviously follow closely on the discussions results. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Marty. Okay, I see 2 hands up. So let me invite the lady first, Michael Ichihara, and then Daniel Twining. Michael?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this very important roundtable, and also, I appreciate all the speakers' comments and talks. I actually share Suk-John's final, concern that when we think about Western leadership, then we might face danger in this era of populism, and the Afghanistan U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is casting a negative sort of image and impact onto the image of the U.S. as a symbol of supporter of democracy. And so we are in a stage where we seriously need to upgrade all those democratic countries or Democrats works. And this is this is very important, especially in order to strengthen the normative discourse of democracy. And Mike said, we have to mainstream, make the democratic values mainstream. And I totally agree with that. And for that purpose, I would I would think two things would be seriously important to take into account. One is that we have to think not only about democracy support, democracy promotion, democratic defense, but mutual learning amongst democracies, and also even declining democracies as well. Because all those democratic countries are facing populist backlash and democratic weakening to some point. And at the same time, we have to include those countries that are falling back to sort of competitive authoritarianism as possible partners in some way, in one way or another. And so in order to do that, mutual learning scheme between those countries will be important to maintain legitimacy of democracy in democratic countries. Second is that, this is especially for the Summit for Democracies, and this is why the Sunnylands Initiative is so important, I think. But we seriously have to have 1.5 track, not only governmental actors, but we need non-governmental actors. That's because, as Mike said, the voice for democracy is much in the citizens or grassroots rather than the governments, and so we have to mobilize those voice, and with that we can strengthen the normative discourse to support democracy. So we probably have to sell the Sunnylands process to put it in the Summit for Democracy more.
Thank you, Michael. I absolutely agree with you to the issue of Myanmar. I think civil society in both South Korea and Japan, they're very active. So I was very impressed. Okay, and Daniel Twining.
Thank you. It's great to see friends in Korea, Japan, India, and beyond. Terrific to be here with you. This conversation has become so much more sophisticated, so congratulations to the organizers. I wanted to amplify a really important point that Jay Panda made and actually connect it to a point that Marty made, which is about the superstructure that NATO created during the Cold War for a free and open system in Europe that enabled democracy to flourish. I mean, we shouldn't forget that, of course, countries like Spain and Portugal were not democracies when NATO was formed, Greece, etc. The alliance architecture created a free and open system that enabled countries to internally democratic reform and democratic change. And of course, a version of the same thing happened in Asia under the US alliance system during the same period, including in South Korea and elsewhere. So to fast forward to the future and what we need to do here, this argument about the Quad that Jay made, I think is central, which is that we, Quad countries plus core allies, Korea, Australia, the reason we care about creating a free and open Indo-Pacific is not because we want to meddle in anybody's politics. Actually, we want to create a free and open system and sustain one, so that Marty's point about democratic change being internally generated, that can happen. It won't happen in a region in which China is the dominant power. China will use its power, as we've already seen, to impose its norms and values. Derek Mitchell and I did an event yesterday with the US ambassador to Cambodia, looking at the state of democracy in Southeast Asia in light of International Democracy Day, which is tomorrow. And we talked about how, among other things, Cambodia has a population, 65% of Cambodia's population is young people. Guess what? They don't like it that they have a leader who's been in power for 40 years. There is not one opposition MP in parliament. One reason Hun Sen has been able to sustain this corrupt monopoly of power is with the active sponsorship and support of China. So we care about a free and open Indo-Pacific so that countries can make their own choices. And I think this argument about sovereignty should be front and central in the conversation about democratic resilience, which is that the threat to sovereignty doesn't come from the United States or other Western powers in Asia. The threat to sovereignty in Asia comes from the big neighbor who is very active in third countries' politics. Look at Australia, look at Cambodia, look at Sri Lanka, look at many countries in between. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think we should discuss more about the proper direction of a Quad, because some Asian countries a little bit twisted if it's understood as a kind of Asia's NATO type. Okay, and I have two gentlemen, Ambassador Yukio Takasu and then Niranjan Saos. So Ambassador Takasu, you are first.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. The good news I can tell you is that there's now a contest for new prime minister in Japan. It took a couple of more months. And it is basically a contest between two gentlemen, Mr. Kishida and Mr. Kono. We don't know yet about one of these. But whoever, become eventually prime minister of New Japan, they will be very strong supporter of this democracy promotion and, that's what we are working. And Mr. Kishida is very closely associated with our study group himself. And he is always speaking about his platform. Of course, he may not make it eventually because Mr. Kono is now gaining a little bit steam. We don't know. But Mr. Kono is also very outspoken in terms of value, the based diplomacy. So whatever happens, Japan will continue to be strongly involved in this process. So I think December summit, new prime minister is going to come with very strong commitment, and I hope with concrete commitment. Let's see. Couple of things before I go just talk about summit and also Quad or Democracy 10 or whatever, grouping and other things. First of all, I think we all of us prepare for very good counter narrative for Chinese propaganda, because it seems to me major problem for China is discrepancy between what they say and what they do. I think this is something that we should be very, very clear and speak out. For instance, internally, they say that China is only interested in raising welfare and living standard of people. And they're respecting human rights and welfare of people. Of course, we know that is not. Externally, China is saying that they're not exporting its authoritarianism or political system, or not interested in creating zone of influence or new world order. Of course, they're doing. Or China is saying that they're against the decoupling of technology and other things, because they're doing their own, creating their own supply chain, their own independence. Also, they're doing their more providing global public goods. Of course, some ABRI and other vaccines, but there are a lot of programs, as some of you already mentioned. So I think these are the facts that we have to be prepared. Second point is that everybody is speaking of decline of the US and rise of China. And Chinese interlocutors are saying that the US has no right to speak for the position of strength anymore. What basis you speak, you teach us or preach us, that is what's saying. And the diplomat are also saying in many parts of the world. But I think we should be very also aware of other side of the coin, the vulnerability of China. See, they are very, very dull, because China's power and influence in terms of authoritarianism come from economic and technological strengths, not values or political and cultural influence. So where, China will the certainty that will win US economically and technologically and keep growing. Of course, if US makes mistake, is not doing properly, of course it happens. But so long as US is going to do right policy, I don't think it's going to happen. For instance, demography. As you know, China is overinflating their population because population is very important for them. But it's already peaked out already. And their 1.4 billion is overinflated, they say. And of course, it's, already a few years ago, it's peaked out. And the working age population is very much shrinking and becoming a very quickly aging society. And welfare from this will be very, very big burden. And also economic gap in the country is very serious, that, This, let me see, more than 600 million people, according to their prime minister, Chinese prime minister. Means 40% population, official statistics, living on less than $140 per month. And top 1% of Chinese has greater wealth than the bottom 50%. There's a major gap here. And also, there are now this restricting social viability, controlling business, controlling education, controlling culture activities, you know that. This is killing the vitality and the spirit. And also, whatever they say, they are friends, but not friends there, you know. But US has real friends and allies, partners. So you can see from all this, there's no certainty that China is going to be continuing winning and is continuing to decline. And here, I think it's important to counter Chinese influence in terms of population. India, Quad, you mentioned Quad. I think it's important, but I think we should not just expand Quad because Korea has a hesitance to enter into Quad. See, because there is military connotation there. So, but anyway, enlarging these partners, I think crucial membership is India and Indonesia. Two countries altogether, $1.6 billion, by bigger than China and other things. So that's, but having said that, I think last occasion I mentioned, what is the functional cooperation we can promote? You mentioned about corruption and transparency in infrastructure and loans and other things. That's one thing I think we could promote. And another area is the gender issue, women's empowerment. I think that's also important too. And one more thing I would say is that the protection of independent media and civil society organization, particularly those people are struggling in Myanmar, Thailand, and the Philippines, Afghanistan. You see, I think we should create mechanism. Although NED doing, US Congress doing, many foundations doing, but I think when you have a summit of democracy, initiated by president, and then what concrete outcome of this is just, this general commitment, importance of shared value and other things. It's a pity. I really hope that they should come up with very concrete step to support those people who are struggling and fighting. And if you think about, these people in Myanmar, for instance, it's, they really need every support I think we can give. And going back to this, the membership of partners. Well, India, US, Japan, Australia, I think there's a very core group, whatever you call it. I don't call Quad because it's a democracy partnership. But when we talk about, you mentioned, Mike mentioned that basically, there is transatlantic connotation. Obviously, we talk about authoritarianism, it is not on China, but also Russia. So therefore, European, countries are very much interested in Hungary or Poland and those things. Of course, it's a global issue, democracy. But I think main focus should be, when we talk about democracy versus authoritarianism, I think with China and free and open Indo-China. I think in the Indo-Pacific. I think this has to be focus of the Summit to Democracy. So therefore that, it's a pity if that Eurocentric membership, participation on the summit, and then from Asia, only Japan, the Korea, and Indonesia, India are invited, and all others, in addition to Australia and New Zealand, are European countries. Difficulty is a choice. And Mike mentioned Vietnam. I think Thailand and Philippines, unfortunately, at this moment, when we talk about summit of democracy, not summit for democracy. Summit for democracy is like a body, Iran and then any country, Syria, any country who want to be aspiring to be democracy, they can be. But when it forms summit of democracy, I think, at this moment, Thailand and Philippines, it's very, very problematical to be included in the first meeting. But I think it is very important, I think, and the question is which country? Again, I mean, it's a private meeting, Singapore is a small China. So I think it's out of question when we talk about this. So Vietnam is one candidate. And we know that Vietnam has a very political system of one party rule. So it's but I think one more ASEAN country. I think it's very, very important if Indonesia is not feeling alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, South Korean government has changed its position about the Quad Plus. So among the three agendas, they are showing the interest in the pandemic partnership and also emerging technology. Okay, let me invite Niranjan Sahu.
Thank you, Sukjang. My bandwidth is really poor, so I'm actually speaking actually without video.
Okay.
Thanks for organizing this very, very productive session, and it's been so useful. I mean, in last 1 hour, I just wanted to raise a point about what Mr. Panda actually said, a very candid statement in which he actually illustrated, especially one striking part of his speech was about the climate change. The climate change aspects is in fact is a major kind of I would say testing time for the democracies, especially given that election cycle, short-termism, several other compulsions that democracies face, and taking a lot of time, very hard decision on unpopular decisions, whether to stop fossil fuel and several decisions that would actually require considerable political will. This is actually right time to debate about that, and taking this further, actually, especially the democracy and climate change. The one geopolitical dimension which is emerging, what I actually see is especially the relationship between China and the US, worsening. And now you would have actually seen in recent times how China is almost trying to bargain, using climate change response as a bargaining chip with United States and other powers to extract no kind of pound of flesh in sort of it's making a hard bargain. And this I see is actually going to emerge as another kind of geopolitical kind of frontier in which actually democracies have to actually put off in a very united kind of face, because China is not alone here. There are other countries also who join China's party. So I think this is something on which actually we need probably more sort of debate and discussion, because otherwise everyone's fate is actually doomed with this particular aspect. So I just wanted to raise this.
Thank you, Niranjan. Let me invite Mr. Kimitoshi Yabuki.
Thank you very much. My name is Kimitoshi Yabuki. I'm a member of the Democracy for Future, Mr. Taka's group. And thinking about what Mr. Takasu mentioned, I think we need to some representative at the summit meeting from other countries like the Philippines, the Vietnam, Cambodia, either. Of course, their governments are very authoritarian at this moment. However, I would like to emphasize the role of civil societies. Civil society, they exist. There exists a civil society in each country. I worked in Cambodia for 25 years, and in 1990s, everybody, particularly young group, try to pursue the country being the civil country, in the democratic country in the future. But at this stage, Mr. Hun Sen's the government has lasted for 40 years, so they lost their interest. However, still the young people do not lose their interest in the democracy system. So seeing carefully their countries, there are some civil societies still existing, and they try to discuss the democracy, and Hong Kong too, and Taiwan too. And of course, Taiwan has a little big sensitive issue. However, Taiwan has a big group of civil society for the democracy. And I'm now working for the people, particularly Bar Association in Afghanistan, try to let them evacuate from their countries. So, however, they still thinking the democracy is very stable. It takes time, However, the democracy is much better than authoritarian scheme. So my recommendation is try to find out the good civil society groups in each country and ask them to come to the summit meeting. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think our Japanese friends are emphasizing in including more civil society actors to all this kind of network talking about democracy. I don't see any new hands up, and we have about 15 or 17 minutes left. So why don't I ask speakers to respond to these comments and questions from the order of Mr. Yoon and Mr. Panda and Mike Green. So why don't I ask Professor Young-Kwan Yoon say first?
I'm sorry, who you want? Could you say the order again?
Yeah, I like to reverse the order.
Reverse order, right.
Because Mike, you are going to say a lot about the US summit. Professor Yoon Young-Kwan?
Yes, it was all very interesting and stimulating discussions, and I benefited much from those discussions. And especially, I think it is interesting the idea of civil society's role in promoting democracy. I agree with that idea. So I don't know whether policymakers of democratic states are really having some plans and ideas, concrete ideas about stimulating and promoting international interactions at the civil society level. I think that idea may be one that we need to pay more attention. And on the issue of in South Korea's participation, as Suk-jong already mentioned, I think President Moon's position on the Quad has gradually changed toward a more active participation and connecting South Korea's new Southern policy to the Quad cooperation or something like that. I think also South Korea's participation in Quad will help South Korea to have more cooperative relationship in the field of technology and climate change and some other important issues like anti-terrorism, etc., etc. So I think that's a positive change in terms of South Korea's position. And actually, I haven't heard any kind of response to my suggestions of three things, and I would appreciate some views from other participants on that specific suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. If I remind his suggestion, it was how we can create a network to fight back against the digital authoritarianism, how we can counter the China's digital authoritarianism. And second was creating emergency fund to use when China and other autocracies retaliate democracies using their economic coercion. And third was as an alternative to BRI, how this Build Back Better world can be materialized, especially using Asian donors. Okay, I don't know whether two other speakers can respond to these suggestions from Mr. Yoon. And let me invite Mr. J. Panda.
Thank you. In fact, I thought that Professor Yoon's suggestions were very thought-provoking, and I meant to comment on that anyway. So in terms of, I'd like to put this in the context of the concern that China raises, which is so overt in our discussions. Now, over my many years in Track 2 participation, for a very long time, it was the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody would talk about. But over the course of the last several years, I think it has become increasingly out in the open, and even in open discussions, not just in Chatham House Rules discussions, the concerns are being discussed very openly. So apart from the democratic challenges I spoke about, of course, India faced aggression, and we lost lives on our border last year. Suddenly, a peace which had held for 45 years ended with firing and deaths because of China's aggression. So we took actions in line with some of the thoughts that Professor Yoon had raised. For example, India has banned a very large number of Chinese apps which have clear security concerns, from mass used apps like TikTok to several other apps, which now it's becoming increasingly clear that they do have very serious security concerns, and it is not just finger pointing in the wild. We have also taken action unilaterally on economic terms, because China was dumping all kinds of equipment and material into the Indian economy to grab market share, which would have made it very difficult to deal with them beyond a certain point. Now, of course, we've had to do this on our own, and it's not been easy. It's very tough. But we see other countries, as Professor Yoon pointed out, we've seen what has happened to Australia. And I strongly support the idea that democracies need to work together to arrive at some common consensus. Now, whether we can come up with the funding for emergency support, I think it's a great idea, but it'll require some consensus building. I think there is equally great potential to work out norms, whether it comes to data privacy rules, for example. Now, on the principle that the internet should remain united, that trade should remain as free as possible, China has got a free pass on many of these issues. So if we can begin to thresh out certain lowest common denominator agreements in terms of data privacy, in terms of perhaps on the trade front, perhaps on the climate change front, I think these are perhaps baby steps, but they will be necessary in the path forward. And one last thought I would like to share is that we face challenges from extremes of both the right and the left. In India, we still have left-wing insurgency, armed militancy, with clear links beyond our borders. And you can see, very often you find Chinese weapons being recovered from these places and situations. So it's time that we start taking concrete steps, but I'm very much in favor that even if they're baby steps, whether they are on the economic front, whether they're on the regulatory front, we need to start working out. And one final thought is that civil society is a double-edged sword, because very often, while doing a lot of good, it also starts picking faults with other nations. And we can always find faults. I mean, you can find faults in India, you can find faults in the US. I think one of the principles I'd like to advocate is that once a country meets a certain standard of democracy, to nitpick on where they haven't yet improved is less productive than to keep the spotlight on those other countries which are not democratic and are the real problem. that would be my final thought.
Thank you. That's a great point. And Mike Green, I'm sure you have lots of things to say, and especially on the democracy, the summit on democracy, right? Is there any chance it can be a 1.5 track, or it's going to be only the governmental talk? Mike?
Well, Leanne and Dan and Derek may know a lot more about that question, but my sense from talking to the officials in charge of this in the White House is that they are looking to include 1.5 track and civil society for sure. I mean, they came to our session, Sunnylands session, with VCMs, embassies from democratic countries enthusiastically. They want to do outreach. So I think you'll find the administration's very enthusiastic about that. Now, they may need a more proactive move from the governments of Korea or India or from civil society groups to make that happen, but I think they're very open to it. And, Ambassador Takasu asked whether, how it would work to have a summit of democracies. I corrected in the chat and said it's a summit for democracy, on democracy, and then Dan corrected me, it's a summit for democracy. But the main point is that they've cast this in a way where it's not a summit of democracies like the old Madeleine Albright grouping. And I would hope that they can find a way to have a kind of variable geometry where, as I was saying earlier, the core participants, there should be a high threshold for participation. But for my part, I would like to then see, satellite meetings where Indonesia or Korea do what I would call outreach. And if you cast it as outreach on democracy, I think you could cast the web pretty broadly and include the Philippines and Thailand, at least civil society, maybe even Vietnam, although there's a big debate about Vietnam in our country in this context. But flexibility and variable geometry while maintaining a high definition and a high standard for democratic governance at the core. I think that's how we defeat the Chinese narrative. I worry that if it's too narrow, too transatlantic, the Chinese counter narrative will be more successful than we like. And that's a really, I have an idea, I don't have a concrete answer, but I think that is why the Sunnylands process and dialogue with partners in the region is so critical and needs to catch up to the very fulsome discussion we're having with Europe. I really like Yoon Young-Kwan's suggestions. I agree with all of them. If I can briefly comment on each. On BRI and Build Back Better, there is a FOIP, a Free and Open Indo-Pacific Partnership with MOUs on infrastructure that includes the signers of the US, Australia, and Japan. Korea has agreed to participate bilaterally with the US on FOIP, but what I'd really like to see is Korea join with this broader effort, which I think also will increasingly include Britain and Denmark and European countries, and through the Quad, India. And I'd really like to see Korea not just have a kind of bilateral cooperation with the US, but be part of this larger effort in the Indo-Pacific that includes Australia, Japan, India, and increasingly European countries and Canada. The idea of a fund or an emergency fund to counter Chinese economic embargoes is also a very good idea, and it relates to democracy because China is using economic embargoes to punish countries for free speech and democratic practices. We are studying this at CSIS. My colleague Matt Goodman has a major study. It's much more complicated than you would think. For example, we could set up a fund, but the problem is if China boycotts wine from Australia, wine from California fills the gap. And it's very hard in the US system for the US government to tell California wine growers you cannot export to China. So it turns out to be much more complicated as a matter of economic statecraft than the democracy supporters would want. But we're working through it, and I think we should keep pushing. And at a minimum, there should be a quick reaction process where countries can quickly mobilize in response to economic embargoes. The exact toolkit's going to take some time. And I think technology is really critical, as a number of people have said. And I just joined the board of Radio Free Asia, and heard my first briefing, Derek and Dan, I'm sure know a lot more about this, but my first briefing on the details of how China is using technology to spread disinformation in Taiwan, of course, but in Southeast Asia, and even in the United States. And the disinformation campaign is increasingly like the Russians in the way that the Chinese do it. And it's aimed at discrediting democracy. So I think this is an area where we should plurilateralize or increase cooperation to counter those narratives using technology, using NHK, using Radio Free Asia, using our own information tools, not to do propaganda, but to shed a light on truth. So last thing, if I could, on the Sunnylands process, the NED and CSIS, together with our partners in the US, are looking to host another meeting. We're holding on to November 8, 9, or 10. Our hope is we can do it in person at CSIS, where certainly the people based in Washington can attend. And we're hoping we can fly some participants from Asia. And we're hoping you can come without facing 2 weeks quarantine when you go home in November, but we'll have to see. But our goal is to have a meeting November 8, 9, or 10, public broadcast hybrid symposium, in person and Zoom. We will arrange some keynote speakers from the administration and Congress, and then try to set up some confidential roundtables with the administration as well in the month before the summit for democracy. So, and we'll also roll out some of the research we've done on different approaches to democratic governance and support for democratic governance in the Indo-Pacific. So stay tuned for that. We'll Lynn and I and others in Washington have to coordinate on the timing, and we have to watch how all of your governments are handling quarantine. Hopefully it'll get better, but we're not sure. But anyway, one way or the other, we're looking at November as a next version of Sunnylands for the public piece, at least the part we do in Washington. The nice thing about Sunnylands is it's so it's sort of the way I envision the summit. There's a core group of us who agree very much in a very sophisticated way on our principles, but it's organic, and each participant is building their own franchise and efforts. And so our next iteration will be November. So please stay tuned for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to add that actually, South Korea is forging a partnership with the European countries, like with Denmark. So we hosted P4G, the Partnering for Green Growth and the Global Goals. And also South Korea has created the AWEB, is a kind of election agency for the developing countries. So more than 100-something countries are participating. So it's a good sign, good move for Korea to move. Before I sum up our webinar, Derek, Mitchell, you want to say something, Derek? Because I see your face.
Yeah, thank you. I wrote what I wanted to say in the chat. I unfortunately had to cut away to do some other things for about 45 minutes in the middle, but it's just great to see everybody here. I do think that we ought to think about, and we already are at NDI, along with others, what kind of satellite events around the summit might be worthwhile to do. I think I heard earlier on about how Asia feels it has been on the outside of this. We have a unique ability to pull, folks into this. Everything I hear from folks in the White House and otherwise is that our expectations should be managed about what the summit is going to be in December. That a lot of it has been about, shape of the table and who's at the table. But I think we can fill that gap and give it some support before and after in our own interest to get this democracy agenda on the top. And I really hope that we bring in, as we think about transatlantic things, to make it universal, not just make it Asia here, Europe there, but do Europe and Asia and Africa together as part of our satellite effort. So just throw that out there. But I apologize for missing most of this, but it's great to feel momentum in this effort.
Great. Ambassador Takash, want to say something briefly?
Thank you very much. Briefly on Professor Noon's three-hardcore proposal. The reason that I couldn't comment earlier because I spoke too much already. But very briefly on this idea of helping each other when they're subject to coercive measures by China. It reminded me of these countries who got suffering from UN-imposed sanctions on Iraq invasion. There are many countries with economic, suffering from sanctions. And there was an idea of creating a fund for this one. It didn't work in terms of magnitude of resources and in terms of application and other things, because China would not officially declare that putting sanction on those things. Korea was subject to, Japan was it's boycotting also and things. And what has been working really in the recent past is, for instance, Taiwan's subject by boycotting of China for buying pineapple. The Taiwan is, supplying pineapple. It's not the government to Japan, but Japanese people voluntarily bought a lot of pineapple voluntarily. When Australia is subject to, coercion and lobster, Japanese people, companies buying a lot of lobster from Australia, and the business level, there are a lot of things. And I think this kind of, many levels, but the creating fund itself is something I think is a very much more complicated subject. And the concept of build back better is something that it's very, very important. And in that way, for instance, UN is promoting this revitalizing implementation of sustainable development goals, because that has been seriously impacted by COVID-19. And the situation is getting really, this backward. So that we are really in UN is trying to revitalize this implementation. I think that is a good means to create a Build Back Better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the time is up. I don't have any intention to wrap up this topic, geopolitics and democracy. It sounds like I have to write a paper on IR. So I'm not interested in doing this. Instead, I always feel the Asian democracies can do better, and actually they are doing more compared to the past, but there's a lack of coordination among Asian democracies. That's our weakness. So to this, the whole, I think the role of America as a bridger is very important. Of course, we can identify some European countries, but America as a friend and as a country who is leading all these democratic norms and values and coalitions, U.S. role is critical. So I'd like to, it's my honor, and it was very fun to have this topic, geopolitics and democracy, and we will like to continue this kind of conversation to the future. And I'd like to thank the three great speakers, Mike Green and Jay Panda and Yoon Young-gan, and also excellent members of this network for the live discussion. Thank you very much, and see you all next time.
Thank you very much, Suk-chang.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.